Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Ronnie Hill and I'm an associate with the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland. And it's my great pleasure today to be in conversation with Bruce Adamson, the Children and Young People's Commissioner, Scotland. So hello, Bruce, and welcome.
Hi, Ronnie. It's good to be here. Good to see you.
It's great that you could make the time. I know that you're busy, so we're really pleased to have you. I'm quite sure that there's lots of folk who will be really interested in what you have to say. But there may be some who don't know that much about your job. So here's your chance to give that elevator pitch. Here's that chance to tell everybody what your job is and why you were really desperate to do it.
Brilliant. My favorite question. My job is the best job in the world. I say that every day as Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland, because it's my role to safeguard and promote the human rights of children and young people all across Scotland. And so that's everyone up to the age of 18 or up to 21 for care experienced young people, recognising the additional obligations that we owe to them. And so in usual times, I would spend a lot of my days out and about, visiting schools and community centres, doing things like going camping, basically sitting on the floor, painting, glitter, all sorts of things, going to places where children and young people are, finding out the things that matter to them, and then taking their voices and amplifying them and supporting them to go to places of power and challenge adults to do better in terms of children's rights. And so it's this really amazing job where I've got powers to hold those in power to account. And I do that by working directly with children and young people to get them into places where they should be already. And so it's brilliant. The office was set up by an Act of Parliament in 2003, the Scottish Parliament, and it was one of the few examples of where it was a piece of committee legislation. So it wasn't a government initiative. It was the Parliament itself that created the Commissioner, recognising that children and young people don't have the same political or economic power as adults, and their rights are really at risk. And so they need someone who's independent, but who's got legal powers to hold decision makers to account. And so I'm appointed for a period of 6 years. I'm entirely independent of government. I report to Parliament, and I've got secured funding through the Parliament and lots of protections, which means I can't be removed from office if I upset people in power, which is really handy because I do that quite a lot. And also there's really strong legal powers to do things like do investigations, but also to do things like research and engage with those in power as well. So it is an amazing job, and that's probably the reason why you're only allowed to do it for 6 years. And so I'm coming up into my last couple of years now.
Last couple of years, yeah. So you've got plenty of time then to tell us about what kind of achievements that you think that you've made thus far and where you want to go over the next 2 years. But I just want to ask you a wee bit more about about your independence and also about the investigations. But let's start with the independence. You are funded through Parliament. So not through the local government, not through central government, not by health boards. Yeah. But what kind of clout do you actually think that you've got with this independence? And can you give us some examples of where that independence has worked to the benefit of children's rights in your view?
Yeah, that cuts right to the heart of what we do. So the idea of having an independent children's rights institution actually goes back to when we were creating the human rights system at the UN level 75 years ago, and saying that it's all very well to have these obligations between states in terms of what we need to do for human rights, but the international system's quite weak in holding those in power to account. So you need someone who's on the ground who can actually work with children and young people and hold those in power to account. And that's going to be most effective if you have a statutory framework, so you have a law that guarantees that independence, that person can't be removed from office, that they've got funding, all of that stuff to allow you to be brave and not have to worry about having your funding cut or being removed from office or upsetting people. So that's really important. And it's written into the UN rules, that the Paris Principles, and also the Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a general comment, a statement. They're the second one of those, saying you've got to have all of these protections and powers for a children's commissioner. And how that's been, how I've applied that, I took a very strong position when I came in that my job was to hold government to account. There's also part of my job is to help build the capacity of local authorities and health boards and government and things, and work with them. But I thought there was a real accountability deficit. And so most of my attention, I shifted the office's focus to being really much more about accountability. And some of the things that I was hugely concerned about when I came in were things like the fact that we still allowed for the physical punishment of children in Scotland, one of the last countries in Europe to do so. And we had a law that said you could be justified in assaulting a child for the purpose of punishment. And that's untenable in international law. The government didn't want to change that law. They said, actually, this is a bit of an interference in family life, and we'd rather do it through soft measures, through education and things. And so I really challenged them very strongly in saying that's not enough, and we need to change the legislation here. Worked very closely with civil society, and ended up being a bill brought forward by John Finney, MSP, which came into force last year, which is really exciting, bringing us into line. That was something that government didn't support until quite late in the process. The age of criminal responsibility is another really good example, but probably an example of failure on my part, because Scotland still has the lowest age of criminal responsibility. We still use the criminal law to address harmful behavior of children, which is the wrong approach and doesn't respect their rights. It's not good in terms of victims either, because we know that it doesn't actually stop reoffending and recidivism. And so really strongly arguing to move that from 8, and government agreed to move it to 12, but actually the international minimum is 14. Mm-hmm. And so we're still below, even when this new law comes into effect, it moves it to 12, still below that. And so what I was able to do was bring a lot of international focus from the UN and the Council of Europe on government, but wasn't able to convince them. So even though I've got this independence and this power, doesn't always mean that I'm able to be successful. And then incorporation as well. It's a really important one where we've been able to push and challenge government too.
Yeah. I'd like to come to incorporation later, because I think it's really important to look forward as well as to look back. But at the moment, we're still just looking back on your achievements to date. And I wonder if just an observation. I was working with the Turkish government some years ago to help them put quality assurance measures in place, internal quality assurance in relation to children who were looked after by the state. And I was asked what the level of the level of criminal responsibility was in Scotland. And the senior civil servants and politicians just about fell off their chair when I had to tell them it was 8. So we don't always get it right in Scotland. But in saying that, I don't think that the debate is over there. It's at 12 now. And if we look forward 5 or 6 years, do you think there's any possibility of it moving up to 14, for example?
Oh, I think it has to. I mean, I think the position that we were in, and actually the age of 12 hasn't yet come into effect yet. We haven't had that commenced, and so even though the Parliament has decided on 12, that's still untenable at international law. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has been saying for many years that 14 is the minimum, and that 15 or 16 actually delivers better results in terms of bringing children back into the community and helping kind of support them. And so that's where we need to be heading. 14 was the minimum for many years at the UN level, and the Council of Europe and the EU all consistently saying 14 is the absolute minimum for many years. And the UN a couple of years ago actually updated its 10-year-old guidance on this just to reflect the position they'd taken for many years. So 12 was never the target. 12 was never a progressive thing. 12 takes us off being the absolute worst to being worst equal, pretty much, with many other countries. And so it's really not something that we should be proud of. So even 14 isn't really the target. Children up to the age of 18, and that's what we need to be looking at, is a justice system that recognizes children as children up to the age of 18 and finds effective ways of working with them. And I think particularly when you look at the children who are in conflict with the law, and how many of them have mental health issues, how many of them are care experienced, how many of them have been affected so badly by poverty. Children's harmful behavior is a representation of failure by the state to not properly support those children and the families and communities around them. So the idea that we hold children responsible and we punish them for that behavior rather than take a welfare-based approach is just entirely wrong. And it's not effective from a victim's point of view either, because one of the big things we know from talking to victims, the majority of whom are children when we're talking about offences by children, harmful behavior by children. If you talk to victims, one of the big things that they're really concerned about is that it doesn't happen again to them or someone else, and that kind of restitution and the support. It's not usually about the punishment bit. And so I'm really confused in a country like Scotland, where we do so well in so many things, and we talk about children's rights, and we've got a First Minister that talks about love, and we've made so much progress. I'm really confused as to why we feel the need to punish children by using the criminal law, when what we really need to be doing is supporting them. So we do need to move further forwards, but I'm concerned that we're talking about 12, or even that we're talking about 14, because we really need to be talking about how we support all children up to 18, and then transition for young adults as well.
Yeah, I'm with you in that one. I've always thought that it was a bit ironical that we have a children's hearing system which is meant to look at the child in a holistic way and not sit on the offence, as it were. How do you do that where the criminal responsibility, age of criminal responsibility is still at 14, but referrals can be made to the children's hearing right up until 18. It just doesn't sit well. Still doesn't sit well. So maybe we just need to keep going with that one, Bruce.
Absolutely no. That's one of the things about human rights is you get used to disappointment, but it doesn't. That just drives you on. So
yeah. So you don't see it as a partial victory. What you see it is still a disappointment, and it's more work to do on it.
Yeah, a lot more work to do. I mean, I was really disappointed by that one, because I thought that the evidence was overwhelming for a move higher, and I was very disappointed that we ended up for some reason obsessed with this age of 12, which I think is totally unhelpful, because 12 isn't an age that we should be using as any kind of bar. And even if we'd got to 14, I would have wanted more, but at 14 at least would have brought us in line with the international minimum standard.
Bruce, you've described the purpose of your job, and you spoke about one of the powers that you have, which is power of investigation. Can you give us an example of how you're using that power and what you hope to achieve by it?
Yeah, this is a really important power that we have to basically compel information from public bodies on issues that we're not able to resolve in other ways, and then issue a report to Parliament and demand action on something. And one of the issues that's been a really long-standing concern is the use of restraint and seclusion, particularly within educational settings. And this is primarily impacting on neurodiverse children, other disabled children, particularly non-verbal children, and parents and families have been raising this for a number of years. There's been long-running petitions to Parliament, and we were really concerned that local authorities across Scotland within educational settings didn't have proper policies in place around this, and then also weren't properly recording instances. And so parents and carers and families were noticing physical injuries, and they were going unexplained. And so what we did is we asked all of the local authorities in Scotland, we compelled all of the local authorities in Scotland to tell us about what policies they had in place for restraint and seclusion, how children and families had been involved in the development of those policies, and then what they were doing to monitor the compliance with those policies. And the results that we got back were very much as we expected. Very few comprehensive rights-based policies in place. Almost no policies were developed with children and with parents and carers in mind, and very low levels of monitoring. And what was really positive, though, was that there was really good engagement right across Scotland. The problem was acknowledged, and actually many local authorities moved very quickly to start to remedy that. So I think it was a really good example of an issue that had just been rolling along and people had been raising concern, but action wasn't being taken. And then this very specific use of our powers just to shine a light on it and then report to Parliament, just brought it to light in a way that then local authorities responded to it. And so it wasn't kind of waving around the big threats, but it actually opened up a dialogue that was really useful. And it wasn't about naming and shaming particular local authorities or particular schools. It was about saying there's a systemic problem here. Let's work together to address it. And so I'm so pleased that that the families were able to really get involved, the young people themselves were able to get involved, and actually the local authorities and the individual schools were able to really respond really positively to it. And there's still ongoing issues, and particularly when we're talking about something as inherently damaging to rights and interfering with rights as being held mechanically or physically or medically. But being restricted in your movement or being isolated, and again away from social contact. And we know that this type of distressed behavior is a form of communication and shouldn't be dealt with in a way that could be perceived as punishment. And so I think that starting from a human rights point of view, that it's about dignity and respect, and about the fact that these children and young people are trying to communicate their distress, and that restraint and seclusion should not be used to address that. And we need really clear policies around understanding the child and the young person and what works for them to deal with that distress, rather than using these types of things.
I wonder, were the inspectorates and regulators involved in the dialogue around this? So
we're in very regular kind of contact with them. The investigation itself we did by ourselves, but we'd had ongoing dialogue and continue to have lots of dialogue with the inspectorates, which is really useful. This was a very targeted piece of work just to get to that point. But again, everyone has a role. And I think, again, that human rights-based approach to inspection and regulation is something we've been working in partnership on. And that kind of starting point is, how do we ensure the respect for the individual child or young person here, and make sure that we don't put in place policies for maybe good reasons that have an effect that undermine that human dignity.
Okay, let's have a look at the here and now. We're into, what is it, our second, maybe third lockdown with COVID, and I've been in contact with a number of organisations who have done a lot of work to look at the impact on children during this period, and the Family Fund in particular. I've done a lot of research. I think they've spoken directly to 700 families in Scotland who, between them, care for around 900 children with complex disabilities or who are seriously ill. You know, children who live with long-term conditions, for example, or life-limiting conditions. And the information that's coming back from these families is, it's really stark. Half of them having lost income as a result of the coronavirus outcome. More than 3/4 experiencing increased household costs. 7 in 10 families having no financial reserves left in which to draw. Real poverty affecting children there. 2/3 of the families finding that they've got much less both formal and informal support. Remembering that care for these children is sometimes 24/7, and at the same time, they're reporting that mental health, both of the children and of other children in the family who may be young carers, and of course parents and older carers, suffering too. Now, in the context of that situation, if we take the Family Fund research is not unique. There's lots of indicators telling us that this is the kind of situation that families are facing. How do we practically try to help realise the rights of these children in this situation?
Yeah. This cuts right to the heart of all the work we've been doing over the last year. And I think it's important to note that even before COVID, these were big human rights issues before COVID. So poverty was the biggest human rights issue facing children and young people in Scotland before COVID. Mental health was one of the issues that children and young people always raised with me when I spoke to them as one of their top priorities. And it disproportionately affects in terms of poverty, but also the impacts of mental health on disabled children, on young carers. What we've seen a huge change as well is bereavement over the last year as well. More and more children and young people facing bereavement. So these were already our priorities pre-COVID, and what we've seen during COVID is that there's been disproportionate impact on those whose rights were already most at risk. And so we know that the impact in terms of poverty on physical and mental health, on the ability to kind of socialize and engage, we know that the lifelong human rights impacts of experiencing poverty, which is a state failure. And we had the special rapporteur from the UN, so the UN's big expert on poverty, Philip Alston, the former one, over here a few years ago. And we took him to Glasgow to Avenue N primary school there, and he met with children and families and had some of those conversations. We took some of those children across to Geneva as well to actually engage with the Human Rights Council, really highlighting on the fact that this is a state failure. This is one of the most basic things we need to do as a state, is to make sure that everyone has an adequate standard of living. So we're not asking for the world here, we're asking for an adequate standard of living, safe, secure, warm housing, which is adapted to the needs that you have. The highest attainable standard of healthcare. I mean, these are really basic things. And education, which is suited to your needs, that makes sure that every child has an education that develops them to their fullest potential. This kind of holistic education. These aren't aspirational things. These are basic things which the state needs to be providing. And it's really concerning that there were failures before. Suddenly COVID hits and things get worse. But in terms of the answers, so what do we do? One of the number one things is we know what works best is getting cash to families. And there has been some initiatives and additional money put in. It's nowhere near enough. And bearing in mind we're in the middle of winter at the moment, there's a foot of snow outside at the moment. The challenges, additional challenges to families at the moment in the middle of winter, we need to do a lot more to get cash to families, because we know that's the best way to secure children's rights, because families are best placed to know how to use that money. And then the supports as well. A lot of the supports, the school-based supports, which was so important for children, particularly disabled children and other children with additional support needs, that school-based support so vital. And it wasn't just about education, but it's about health support, it's about mental health support, it's about protection, it's about some of those poverty mitigation supports as well, like school meals, lots of those things dropping away because schools are closed at the moment. And so real focus on those children who are most in need of support and who are failing the most, getting those supports to them, hugely important. And two of the things that I think have been really disappointing for me over the last year is, and this is a running theme always from me, is the lack of participation of children and young people in decision making, and particularly disabled children and young people, particularly young carers, care experience, those children who are often left out and ignored the most. They should have been right at the heart of decision making. The first thing government should have been doing was thinking, how are we going to find out how the restrictions we're putting in place are affecting those whose rights are most at risk? And they didn't do that. And I'm hugely disappointed, because I thought we'd made a lot of progress on child participation. But the idea that we were making decisions that were affecting groups of people more than others, and we didn't ask those people, just makes no sense to me, because it meant that we made wrong decisions and we didn't get the support to them in the way that would have worked the most. And so I think that really disappoints me, and that's something we can change really quickly. And it's not about sending out surveys. It's actually about engaging in a dialogue, and a constant dialogue, and making sure that they're part of the decision-making process. And then the use of things like impact assessments. The decisions didn't take into account rights properly because the government didn't use the tools that it should have, like impact assessments. And we actually, along with the Children's Human Rights Observatory in Scotland, actually did our own impact assessment back in the middle of last year, and that was a reaction to the fact that the government hadn't been using some of these basic tools that you need to use to make legitimate decisions. So there's things that we can do using those tools, involving children and young people who've got experience in decision making, and getting direct funding in place and more support into things like schools and community-based supports.
In relation to getting direct funding in where it's necessary, so that children have the basics, as you've explained, are you engaged in dialogue with those who are establishing the new Social Security Scotland system?
Yeah, so we've had kind of good discussion around that, and I think that that's really exciting that in Scotland we're starting to get more options and availability. But I think, and again, central to that has to be the lived experience of people. And so I think there's probably two different things. One is the emergency measures that we need right now, and another thing is building a social security system that actually meets the needs of people in Scotland. One of the really interesting conversations that I've been having with children and young people, because despite not being able to get out and about, we've been able to have a lot of discussions digitally, which isn't the same, but still is useful. Had lots of discussions with young people about whether they think that the experience of COVID might change public attitudes towards things like social security, because unfortunately so many more families are experiencing poverty. So many people have had to be furloughed, or people have been out of work, that perhaps that might start to deliver a change and remove some of the stigma in relation to things like social security. And I think that's probably something that's been happening for a few years now. I've noticed that in the way some of the media portrayals and things, we've started to change our attitude slightly towards poverty. I'm still concerned that there's too much stigma around, but young people were actually quite optimistic about this, saying actually one of the benefits, if it could be called that, from this experience, awful experience we've all been through, might be changes in attitudes towards things like social security. How do we capture that so that we don't go back to the way things were before?
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you see some positive hope there. I say that because I've been a bit worried about the new right-wing thinking, around the sovereign individual who should do everything for themselves, by themselves, keep everything close-knit within your own family and your own group, and basically to hell with everybody else. So I see that there's that kind of thinking is emerging, or has emerged. Do you think that this is a problem in Scotland, this type of thinking, or is it elsewhere? Do you think
I think that's a problem everywhere, and there's a couple of my young advisors who are, if we were doing this in person, I probably would have had them along, who would be speaking very, very strongly to this point, in terms of where we're going wrong. No, I think Scotland still has the same issues that we see elsewhere, and I think that's been a trend for a number of years. But I think we're maybe starting to see a bit of a change in that, and a kind of a reflection back to hopefully kind of a rights-based approach that says actually the purpose of us as a society, we the peoples, coming together to ensure that we have a society that supports us all. I mean, that's the basis of the rights framework, this idea of human dignity, and children growing up in a family of happiness and love and understanding, and the state providing support to parents and carers and families, and the state owing special obligation to disabled children and care experienced children, the state having an obligation to address things like poverty and housing and healthcare. I think that understanding is really important. We're lucky in Scotland. I mean, I think we've got the NHS, which despite I know isn't perfect, but to my mind is one of the best health systems in the world in terms of a public a health system run for the public goods. Again, we've got strong traditions in education. So there's a lot of good things, but we do have to shift back, I think, to an understanding of why those things are important and why those things are social goods. And I think that the rights framework is a really good vehicle for that. So incorporation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also the work that's going on to bring in other treaties, including the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, into our domestic law. These are really good structural things that will help change some of those culture challenges that we've got, that kind of individualism, because that it doesn't work. It's not useful. That widening of wealth, we know, leads to really poor results. And when we look to countries that have better outcomes than we do, one of the things they all have in common is a much stronger focus on social investment.
Yeah, I think that the Alliance is really quite excited about the possibilities around the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and we're looking forward to seeing how that pans out, and not just seeing, but being an active part of trying to shape it. But maybe that's a conversation for another time. But let's about children, of course, and children, disabled children, and those living with long-term conditions are people too. And sometimes I think that people forget that human rights actually relate to children just as much as they relate to adults. So in my view, there's been some unhelpful discussion about what trumps what. You know, is it the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or is it human rights? Well, actually, I'd rather have your view about about that kind of dialogue. I don't think people want to hear from me; they want to hear from you about it.
Oh no, I don't think that's true at all. I'm enjoying the conversation. One of the great things about the human rights framework is that it's all interrelated, and so this beautiful kind of framework and network that we've built of rights all interrelates. There isn't a conflict. Sometimes we need to balance different rights, like the fact that at the moment, during COVID, we need to protect life and public health, and that means that it's necessary and proportionate to put in place interferences with education and family life. And so that's the type of balance that you need to build in to the human rights system. But there isn't a conflict between the rights of individuals. Rather, we've got a complementary system which says that rights are universal. Everyone has them, but the state's got particular obligations in relation to those whose rights are most at risk. And so children have all of the same rights as everyone else, but they also have additional rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child because of the recognition of the kind of vulnerability and the development of children. And this actually goes right back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So right back to the end of the Second World War, when we were developing a human rights framework, the global community, we the peoples, said that childhood was special. And so there's always been a sense that children needed their own rights protections. It took until it took until the 70s before it was actually starting to kind of be in any way kind of brought together. And it was only in 1989, which is still 31 years ago, that we actually got the Children's Convention. But one of the great things when you look through the convention, it starts with this idea that children should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love, and understanding, and talks about parents and kind of families, carers throughout. There's this thread that it's not about children in isolation. It's about the obligation on the state to support families as the best way of ensuring children get their rights. And so that's really important. There's no conflict between adults and children, rather the obligation on the state to support the family around the child to ensure that the child gets what they need. And then again, particular attention within the convention to disabled children and young people, including children with lifelong conditions. So the same rights to highest attainable standard of health, the same right to an education that builds them to the best capacity, that's designed around what they need the most. And it's not just about kind of pure academics, but it's about every aspect to build children to their full potential. And that's mentally, physically, that's everything. Education isn't just about passing exams or being good in academic subjects. It's about building you into the best person you can be. Adequate standard of living, but particular focus on those that need it most. And then within the convention, Article 23 is particularly focused on disabled children in the broadest sense. and saying, and there's special protections to ensure that disabled children get the support that they need, and also recognizing the need for states to do more to ensure that disabled children have a full and decent life, is the terminology that was used, but which focuses on dignity and self-reliance and participation in the community. And so it's all shaped around the child and what they need, but there's particular additional obligations. But it's not a conflict thing, it's additional obligations on the state. And then I think quite beautifully, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which is a much newer treaty, actually takes things even further. And so there's no competition between these. Actually, the UNCRPD, the Disability Convention, actually helps breathe a bit more life into the Convention on the Rights of the Child and helps us understand it. And in fact, there's an amendment at the Parliament, which may well be passed by the time this is broadcast. It's being discussed this week, that would specifically put into the law on the Children's Convention that the court should look at the Disability Convention to interpret children's rights. And so that's how they link together. And I think particularly where we see the UNCRPD, the Disability Convention, going further, kind of talking about the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms, Article 7, but also things like independent living and being included, and the continuity of social care, and that transition in Article 19. Those aren't as fully articulated in the Children's Convention as they are in the Disability Convention. And then again, I think a better description possibly of the right to education in Article 24 of UNCRPD, much more around kind of housing and the type of support you get, and also things like work and employment, which are really, really important, but probably not elaborated very much in the Children's Convention. So the two of them, sorry, I'm on a bit of a rant now, but the two of them work really closely together to give the best possible framework for children and young people and that transition into adulthood.
I think that's really important to give a signal about that, Bruce, to people who may be listening, because I know that many of the organisations and parents groups and so on, who are members of the Alliance and whom we've been speaking with about this, are really concerned that at times of transition, only partial aspects of the young person's life are being looked at, worked on, worked through. Sometimes the young persons are not in control, they're not in charge. Their families aren't really in charge either, but sometimes they have to seize control so that they can actually get things moving in an holistic way. So I'm glad that you've mentioned those aspects, and I think that what we need to see is some action so that they come to life. And maybe this is the point where you switch it, well, not switch your view, but focus in on the incorporation and have a look at what's going on with that now, and what the promise of incorporation actually is in practical terms. And I think that a number of people who will be listening may well have submitted views on incorporation. They may well have discussed it, but there may be others who are sitting thinking, well, actually, what does incorporation do in a practical sense for children and families?
Yeah, I think this is a really, really good question, and something I'm really passionate about. And so I think it's important to understand that the starting point is that we've got these treaties, and so we've got a really broad and often quite confusing framework of UN core treaties, and again, particularly the Children's Convention and the Disability Convention, but also a whole bunch of other conventions around that as well, in terms of the Convention Against Torture as well, really important. Some of the work that we've done on restraint and seclusion of children within educational settings linked in strongly with that Convention Against Torture, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. So there's all of this framework, which is all equally important at the UN level, but then also the Council of Europe and the European Union, which still is important despite Brexit, all setting out these complex framework of complementary rights. But what do they mean in practical terms when you're sitting in Scotland and not getting the support that you need? And one of the problems that we have in a country like Scotland is that when we sign up to these international treaties, they don't automatically become enforceable at domestic law. And so in many countries in the world, they have a constitutional system. When the state signs up to an international treaty, it automatically becomes part of domestic law. We don't. we have a system which says we've signed up to those obligations and commitments at an international level, but we need another step to do it at the domestic level. And traditionally, how Scotland and the UK's approach that is to pass lots of different laws. And so we'll pass a law on housing, and we'll pass a law on education, rather than say we'll take the rights as a whole and put them in and create rights law. And so the one kind of exception to that is we've had the Human Rights Act, which brings in the European Convention on Human Rights, and we've brought that in wholesale. Also, obviously, a lot of the discrimination law that we've brought in terms of equality, we've brought in from European law and learned from that. But what's been missing is actually bringing these rights into domestic effect. And so the most obvious difference, I suppose, is that when the law goes through, and it's got cross-party support, I'm confident it will pass, when it comes into effect, it'll mean that those rights in the Children's Convention are enforceable directly. So every public authority in Scotland, everyone doing a public function, in fact, has to act compatibly with the convention. And if they don't, then we can take legal action. And so the child, which is quite exciting, to challenge them and say, you've failed here. Yeah. And so that duty to act compatibly is really powerful, not because I want to be in court all the time. The worst possible way of resolving any dispute is going to court. But the fact that you can be taken to a court really focuses minds. And what it'll do is deliver a real culture change for those delivering services. Because if they don't consult children and young people, that's breaching Article 12, and we'll be challenging them on that. If they don't set their budget in a way that's focused on using available resources to the maximum extent possible, Article 4 of the convention, we'll be challenging on that. And so we can start to get into planning and budgeting discussions, as well as pointing out some of the real big systemic failures on things like education, on things like poverty and housing, adequate standard of living. And the experience in other countries who have already incorporated is you don't see this big rise in court cases, because no one wants to do it that way. But what you see is a real, quite swift culture change as public bodies realize that they have to do things differently and start to engage in positive dialogue and see very quickly the really positive results of that. And so what we'll be expecting to see is a very quick culture change in a way that we hadn't really seen kind of following previous attempts to do this, where there's the 2014 Act that required people to have a bit of a think about it, have kind of regard to things. But this legal obligation is really going to change and focus minds, because the lawyers and the accountants and others are going to be aware of this as well. It's not just going to be seen as a nice social policy thing to do, but a legal obligation.
Yeah. I think that's very helpful, and of course the legal process is going through Parliament really as we speak, and in fact we had thought that we'd talk to each other at an earlier occasion, and you were being bombarded by journalists asking you questions about this exact subject. But so we're really excited in the Alliance that this is going through Parliament. We'll be really supportive and energised, if you like, by the work of organisations like Together, and bringing forward their expertise in looking at how this might work. And so we're going forward in a positive vein. Having said that, of course, there's always things that might be improved, and some of our members have said that they're a bit disappointed at the apparent lack of recognition of the needs of people, children, young people and parents, or carers with sensory difficulties. And so in their view, there's lack of information or emphasis on the need for good accessible communication in relation to realising rights and so on. And I think they had been looking for something a bit more meaty around, if I can use that phrase, around the discussions in Parliament and perhaps in the way in which incorporation takes place. I don't know what your view is on that issue, Bruce, or if there's something that can be done to improve the situation at this stage.
Yeah, no, that's a really huge issue in terms of it. It's right, again, right at the heart of the idea that children and young people and their families should be involved in decision making. And in order to do that, you need to have information. You need to be so we need much more proactivity on behalf of decision makers. And I do understand the disappointment or concern about the fact that incorporation has probably been very focused, and again this is a big part of my fault, in terms of very focused on the law side of it, on getting the legal accountability, and less so probably on what it means in terms of the implementation. So in the bill there is a requirement for government to set out a scheme, and there's some discussion around what that means. We generally kind of talk about that as the implementation of the convention. And so this has been an obligation for 30 years, have to deliver on these things. What we've probably tried to do in the bill, though, is keep it quite pure in terms of saying this is just about getting the international law into the domestic legal framework. Then the real work starts, because it's quite a technical bill, really. What it does is brings the international law into domestic effect, but actually the obligation already existed and will now be enforceable once this comes in, to actually say you're not doing enough. And so lots and lots of work really needs to be done to focus on making sure that we change the way that we do things, particularly around things like accessibility. And so the sensory stuff that you talked about, so all different forms of accessibility, but also doing much more to engage all children and young people who aren't usually engaged. And again, that includes non-verbal children. Again, we've done a lot of work historically on neurodiversity, and there's lots, and I think a growing understanding amongst decision makers that we're a long way from where we need to be. Yeah. And that those whose rights are most at risk are those that can't engage with the process because we're not doing enough to engage them. So incorporation, the bill is really important, but the real work kind of continues. And what incorporation will do will be allow us to hold those in power to account a lot more. But actually how we do it, the kind of the how stuff doesn't sit within this legislation, it sits alongside it. But the opportunity that we've got with this and the broader work that we're doing to really bring focus to that has to be the ongoing work. And again, big commitment from me to work with anyone who's listening to this. Please do get in touch, because we're always learning, and we're very, very keen to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to put pressure on public bodies and decision makers as well, to really do a lot more and change the way that we communicate, change the way that we make decisions, and because that is what we're looking for. We're looking for something really radical. We're looking for a real change to the way in which power is exercised, and that's going to be uncomfortable for people, and that's going to mean that those in power have to give up and share some of their power. It's going to mean a different way of approaching things, and the first step to that is actually making things accessible and letting people know what's happening.
And so if this needs to be tackled, fully, just prior to the implementation phase, would that be about influencing, say, statutory guidance and those kind of vehicles?
Yeah, so I think influencing statutory guidance, but it's also things like getting involved in children's services planning, getting involved in council budgets and things. Yeah. It's getting involved in every level of decision making and just challenging. And I think that's what incorporation is going to allow us to do, is challenge a lot more and saying, when you're setting a budget and you haven't budgeted for making things accessible, then you're setting yourself up for failure. So it's actually, when we make budget decisions, have we allocated enough budget? Have we got the skills within the organization to even ask the right questions, to engage with people? And so what I'm really expecting to see is some big changes in decision-making and planning, as well as the legal framework around it. But it's that culture change that we're really seeking here.
I think that's interesting in relation to the culture change. It comes back to communities of people being involved with those in power at the earliest stage. Co-production. It's not about being offered, here, 2 choices, take your pick.
Yeah.
That's not the kind of co-production you're talking about at all. It's about building It's about getting right back to the basic building blocks and everyone who should be involved being involved from the beginning.
Absolutely, and that's a human rights-based approach. Participation, it's one of the core values of my organization. And again, I have a group of young advisors in the office, and it's one of my favorite parts of my role is that I get to work with them almost on a daily basis during COVID, but on a very regular basis during other times. And we consult them. Not consult them. They're involved and they led the project on our strategic plan. They lead on events planning. Everything that we do, we work with them, and they help us as well with our broader participation with children and young people. And you'd mentioned Together earlier. One of the amazing things about doing this job in Scotland, and I think I'm the envy of all of my colleagues across Europe and across the world, is how strong civil society is in Scotland. And again, the work of the Alliance, I think, is hugely powerful. I think Together and children's rights terms, hugely powerful. And that's a massive benefit that isn't always true in other countries.
We're kind of drawing close to the end of our time. I can't believe that the time has flown by like this. But one of the things one of the things that I did want to ask you was, what other organisations and how other people can contribute to the work that you're doing. When you're just highlighted on Together there, who are making a substantial contribution there. So, what would you say to others around about how they can do that? And I've had one question submitted to me by people who are interested in health, and the question there is, what kind of contribution can health commissioners make, children's health commissioners make, to realising children's rights?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. Again, pre-COVID, it was a few years ago now. I met with the Association of Health Commissioners and Children's Health Commissioners, and we had a really good conversation around that. And I think they play a really vital role in service design. And again, I think the key part of it is involving children and young people and their families in helping with their role and seeing their role as a human rights role. In terms of how services are designed and delivered. I think that's absolutely essential. And that's probably my wider comment as well, is that you don't need a special kind of mandate, or you don't need any kind of training to be a human rights defender. And that's the term that we use for anyone who is standing up for the rights of others and trying to make a change. And it's thing that I'm hugely proud of the children and young people all across Scotland who are doing things in their communities, in their schools, right across Scotland. It's not about kind of taking a case to court or speaking at the UN. It's about doing what you can where you are and kind of starting there. And I think that's a really important point, is realizing that everyone has a role to play here. And while I think that those in power need to do a lot more to reach out and to actually include people, don't wait for that though. You can also be, a big part of my role is promoting young people being human rights defenders. And so one part of it is saying those making decisions have to do more to ensure participation of children and young people. And that means right from the start, from designing processes. And it doesn't finish. It's a process that's got to involve feedback as well. And so an ongoing discussion has to be built into that co-production model. But also outside of that obligation on decision makers to involve people, you don't have to wait to be asked. You can agitate. There's a really important role in being outside the system. And we've seen that with things like climate justice and Black Lives Matter. We've seen the disabled people in Scotland really being huge leaders and champions in all sorts of fields, but including the rights of disabled people, but across every aspect of human rights as well. So you don't have to wait to be a human rights defender. And then the key to it is just making those links to others who are interested in the same issues as you, and then getting support from organizations like mine and civil society to make sure that you've got the support and the resources and the protection that you need, because you don't want to be in a position where you're speaking out and receiving kind of negative feedback and things. And again, I'm very aware of some of the impacts of things like social media, which has lots of benefits, but also some risks as well. So what I would say is anyone who's interested, kind of reach out, make some of those connections, can contact my office, but otherwise contact civil society organizations, and just start to build up some ideas about what you could do. And then starting from a rights-based approach is really important, because this isn't, none of what we're talking about is charity. These are basic entitlements that the state is failing to give. So you're right to, I spend a little bit too much of my time being angry at the moment, but we're right to be angry about this. We're right to be kind of raising our voices about it, because what's happening is wrong. And this isn't some act of charity that disabled people are given support and appropriate housing and social security support when it's needed, and the right type of education. This is an obligation on the state. And if it's not happening, we have to stand up and shout about it. And my role is to make sure that when you do that, you've got the support. And I think, again, we've got the Human Rights Commission, Scottish Human Rights Commission, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and other statutory bodies who've got a big role here, but also amazing civil society. So so reach out, tell us what you're passionate about, let us know, and we'll help in any way we can to make sure that your voices are heard.
That's great. Bruce, thanks very much for taking the time this afternoon. It's been really great to talk with you. I also want to thank everyone who's signed up and is listening in. You'll have heard this as a dialogue between two people, but I think one of the major thrusts of Bruce's debate here is that the dialogue should be spread far and wide. So please be in touch with them if you want to continue that dialogue. Bye for now.